A taxi driver ended my relationship. Not a private investigator, not a dramatic confrontation, not some tearful confession at midnight. A bloke in a white Toyota Camry on the road between Jomtien and Walking Street, making conversation the way taxi drivers do, said 6 words that restructured my entire understanding of the previous 11 months. 6 words. I have been in business for 30 years. I have negotiated contracts worth millions of pounds, read rooms full of difficult people, prided myself on seeing angles other men miss. And it took a taxi driver 40 seconds to tell me what I had failed to see across nearly a year of living it. That is the part that still gets me, if I am being honest. Not the betrayal, the embarrassment of it. My name is Elliot Chambers, 66 years old, from Sheffield originally, though I have lived out of a suitcase for most of the last 15 years, running an international property consultancy that does most of its actual work across Southeast Asia, Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, resort developments, commercial properties, the occasional residential project for a developer who needs someone who understands both the local market and how to present opportunity to foreign investors without making either side feel patronized. I am good at this. I have always been good at reading situations, identifying the play, staying 3 moves ahead while everyone else is still deciding whether to sit down. I have also, clearly, significant and specific blind spots that my professional competence managed to disguise from me for an embarrassingly long time. I came to Pattaya initially for work, not for the obvious reasons. Though I am aware that saying that sounds exactly like what a man would say if the obvious reasons were, in fact, the actual reasons. A client had a resort development near Jomtien that needed repositioning for a different investor market, and I spent 6 weeks there in what I think was early the previous year, staying at a hotel near the beach, working during the day and eating dinner alone in the evenings at restaurants along the strip. I was not unhappy. I have been alone in more cities than I can count, and I have made my peace with it. But I was 65 years old in an unfamiliar city, and there is a specific quality of solitude that comes with that combination, not loneliness exactly, more like a low-frequency awareness of the gap between the life you are living and the life you had vaguely assumed you would have by now. I was not looking for anything. I was simply, one evening, eating grilled sea bass at a place near Soi Buakhao, and a young woman at the next table asked, in careful English, whether I was enjoying the fish, and I said yes, and we talked for 20 minutes, and that was how I met Wanpen. She was 26. She was small and quick and funny in the way that requires genuine intelligence, not the performed variety. She told me that evening that she worked in hospitality, which is a phrase I processed at the face value it was clearly designed to present. She said she had grown up in Buriram, in the Northeast, and had come to Pattaya 4 years ago for work, and had been meaning to leave for 3 of those 4 years, and had not yet managed it. She said this with a self-deprecating laugh that I found completely charming. We exchanged line details. I messaged her the following day, and we had dinner 2 nights later, and then 3 times the following week, and within a month I had established a pattern of seeing her that felt, from the inside, like something real beginning. I knew she had worked in a bar. She told me herself, which I respected, and she framed it with the matter-of-fact dignity of someone who has made practical decisions in difficult economic circumstances and is not going to apologize for them. She said she had stopped working there 2 months before we met, that she had been saving enough to try something else, that she was looking at doing online reselling cosmetics and skincare, which several of her friends had made work. I believed all of this. I believed it partly because she told it credibly, and partly because the version of Elliot Chambers, who had just met an interesting woman in Pattaya, was not the version inclined to apply forensic scrutiny to the things she said. I am a confident man. Confidence, I have learned at some cost, is not the same thing as being correctly calibrated. The first 4 months were, by any reasonable assessment, excellent. She was attentive and warm and genuinely curious about my work, in a way that felt substantive rather than performative. She asked good questions about property development and the difference between how foreign investors think about risk versus how local developers do, and she retained the answers across conversations, which told me she was actually listening. She met two of my colleagues who were in Pattaya for a site visit in March, a dinner at a good seafood place on the beach road, and they both mentioned afterward that she was sharp and that I seemed well. I was well. I was 65 years old, and a sharp, funny, attentive 26-year-old woman was choosing to spend her time with me, and the part of my brain that has always run slightly ahead of my emotions and warned me when something seems too convenient was, on this occasion, conspicuously quiet. Confidence does that. It tells the warning system to stand down, because a confident man does not get played. She was not living with me. I was splitting my time between Pattaya and Bangkok, where I keep a serviced apartment for my longer stays. But she spent 3 or 4 nights a week at my hotel during the early months, and then, when I moved into a rented condo in Jomtien to see out the project, she had a key and effectively treated it as a second base. Her own place was a small apartment she shared with a friend, somewhere off Soi Buakhao, which I had been to twice and which was perfectly ordinary. Everything was ordinary, in the way that things are ordinary when you are not looking at them with appropriate attention. The first crack appeared in month 5, which I now believe was June, though the month is less important than what it contained. She began canceling our plans with increasing frequency, never dramatically, always with an explanation that was plausible in isolation. A family member visiting from Buriram who needed showing around. A friend going through a breakup who needed company. A cosmetic supplier she needed to meet across town. Each individual cancellation was reasonable. The pattern of them, viewed in aggregate, should have been less easy to dismiss. But I was running a complicated project negotiation that month, and I was genuinely preoccupied, and I rationalized the pattern as the normal irregularity of two busy people whose schedules did not always align. I told myself this, and I moved on and I kept moving on, which is what confident men do when something makes them faintly uneasy. They move on. They do not sit with the unease and examine it. Her phone behavior changed. This one I clocked immediately, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. Because the phone behavior is the thing you always notice, even when you are telling yourself you are not the kind of man who notices. She had previously left it face up on whatever surface was available, which is the phone behavior of someone with nothing to manage. By June, it was always face down, always in her bag when she was with me, always taken to the bathroom during long evenings. I noticed. I said nothing. I told myself I was not the kind of man who makes an issue of phone privacy, which was technically true, and also a convenient way of not engaging with what I was observing. There were other things too, smaller things that I cataloged with the back half of my brain while the front half stayed busy with the Jomtien project and the business calls and the general forward momentum of a man who has decided not to examine something. She started dressing differently when she went out without me. Not dramatically, not in the way you would notice if you were looking for it, but in the way you notice retrospectively once you understand the context. New earrings that appeared without explanation. A particular effort with her appearance on evenings when she was supposedly visiting the friend whose relationship had broken down, an effort that seemed excessive for a consolation visit. I noticed, and I noted, and I continued moving forward. She became vaguer about her schedule. In the early months, she had always been clear about where she was going, and when she expected to be available, the natural transparency of someone who is not managing information. By July, she was answering the question of her plans for the week with increasing amounts of general information and decreasing amounts of specific information. She was seeing friends, handling the cosmetics business, maybe going up to Bangkok for a supplier meeting she was still confirming. When I asked about the Bangkok trip a week later, she said it had not happened. The supplier meeting had been postponed. I said righto and closed that branch of the conversation. But I remembered it because in 30 years of business, the postponed meeting that no one mentions again is always the meeting that was never real to begin with. I found myself, in August, doing something I would have described with contempt if I had seen another man doing it. Checking the timestamps on her line messages to see if there were patterns in when she went silent. If she had been sending messages freely throughout the afternoon, and then nothing for 3 hours in the early evening, and then messages again after 10, that 3-hour window had a shape. It fit the shape of someone who was occupied, in a specific way, during a specific window of time that she had not mentioned to me. I did this for 2 weeks before I made myself stop, not because the pattern was unclear. It was entirely clear, but because continuing would mean making a decision about what to do with the pattern, and I was not ready to make that decision. So I stopped looking, and I resumed not looking, which is not the same thing as not knowing. There was a Saturday in late June when she told me she was spending the day with her friend whose relationship had ended, the same friend she had mentioned previously. And I said fine, and worked through the afternoon on project documents, and then went to a bar near the beach in the evening on my own, a place I went to sometimes to decompress with a beer and watch people walk past on the strip. And at about 8 o'clock, I saw a man I vaguely knew by sight, an Australian expat who lived somewhere in Pattaya and whom I had spoken to briefly at a business event the previous month. He was walking past the bar with a woman who was not his wife, who I had also met briefly. I remember thinking, with the comfortable superiority of a man who believes his own situation is entirely different, something ungracious about expats who cannot seem to stay faithful. I finished my beer and went home. I did not think about the Australian again until several months later, when I would think about him rather a lot. She mentioned a name in July, not prominently, not in a way that should have registered as significant, but I am cataloging the retrospective evidence now, and so it goes in the catalog. She was telling me about a night market she had visited with friends, and she referred in passing to one of those friends as Craig. And when I asked who Craig was, she said, oh, just someone she had met through the cosmetics business, a customer who had become a friendly acquaintance, a Farang who bought gifts for his family in Australia. She said this smoothly and moved on to something else, and I let it move. Craig, Australian, buying cosmetics for his family. I noted this, and I filed it in the same cabinet where I was already storing a dozen other things I was choosing not to examine closely. By August, I was actively fighting with myself, about what I was becoming. The version of Elliot Chambers, who had built a business on clear-eyed assessment, was telling me with increasing force that the pattern I was observing, the canceled plans, the phone behavior, the slight quality of management that had entered her conversation with me, was a pattern with an obvious explanation, and I was actively avoiding the obvious explanation because it was not consistent with the story I was telling about my situation. The version of Elliot Chambers, who had met a sharp, funny 26-year-old woman at a seafood restaurant and believed she had chosen him freely and completely, was telling the first version to mind his own business. These two versions had several arguments, all internal, all inconclusive. I went through her bag once. I am going to put that plainly. She was asleep and I was awake at 3 in the morning with the specific alert insomnia of a man who knows he is avoiding something, and her bag was on the chair by the window, and I went through it. I found a receipt from a hotel on Soi 15, dated 11 days earlier, for 2 nights. We had not stayed at a hotel together in the preceding month. I stood in the half-dark looking at that receipt for what felt like a long time, but was probably less than a minute, and I put it back exactly where I had found it. And I got back into bed, and I lay there until dawn, being very quiet and very still while something reorganized itself in my chest. I did not sleep. I lay there, doing what you do at 4 in the morning, when you have information you are not ready to act on, which is to construct alternative explanations for it. The receipt could be from a girl's trip. The receipt could be from a cosmetics supplier meeting that had required an overnight stay in a nearby hotel because it was more convenient than the commute back to her flat. The receipt could be legitimate in a dozen different ways that had nothing to do with what the receipt looked like to the part of my brain that has spent 30 years assessing situations. I spent approximately 2 hours building these alternatives, examining each one, finding it structurally sound enough to delay the other interpretation, and then watching it collapse under the weight of everything else I had already put in the filing cabinet. The alternative explanations were not convincing. They were time-buying measures. I knew this. I let them run anyway. I said nothing the following morning. This is the part I find hardest to explain about my own behavior during this period, because I am not a man who historically avoids difficult conversations. In business, I have a reputation for exactly the opposite, but the confidence that makes me effective professionally was, in this context, working against me in a specific way. A confident man who raises a concern is implicitly acknowledging that he might be wrong, that something might be happening that he did not see coming, and that particular acknowledgement was something I was not ready to make. So I filed the hotel receipt next to Craig from Australia and the canceled Saturdays, and I kept going. I drove past a bar on Soi Buakhao in mid-September, heading somewhere else, and I saw a woman through the open front of the bar, who resembled Juan Pen closely enough that my foot came off the accelerator before my brain had finished processing. It was not her. Different hair, different build once my eyes adjusted to the neon, but my reaction to that half-second of misidentification told me something useful about the state I was actually in. My heart had hit my sternum with the force of a man who has been frightened, and I sat in traffic for the next 3 minutes, breathing carefully and telling myself that my reflexes were not evidence of anything. They were, of course, evidence of exactly what they appeared to be. A man who had been living with sustained low-level anxiety about his situation for months and whose body had stopped pretending otherwise, even if his mind had not quite caught up. She confronted me, which is to say I confronted her, in September, which is to say I raised something vague, and she turned it inside out before I had finished the sentence. I said, as carefully as I could manage, that I felt she had been less present recently, and I wanted to check that everything was all right. She looked at me with an expression of such genuine seeming concern that for a second I thought I had entirely misread the situation. She said she had been stressed about her family finances, that her mother needed some dental work that was expensive, that she had not wanted to burden me with it. She cried a little, not dramatically, just the specific evidence of a person carrying something heavy that she has not wanted to put down on someone else's floor. I said, of course, don't worry. Let me help with the dental costs, which I did. 12,000 baht transferred to her the following day. She thanked me with warmth and affection, and I went back to believing that I had simply misread a period of personal stress as something it was not. I am 66 years old, and I was funding the dental work of a woman who had a hotel receipt from Soi 15 in her bag and a cosmetics customer named Craig from Australia who was becoming difficult to ignore. I want to be straight with you about how stupid that makes me feel, sitting here now with the benefit of the complete picture. The confidence that told me I was in control of this situation was not intelligence. It was ego wearing intelligence's clothing, and it cost me about 4 months of clear sight that I would have used better with slightly less certainty about my own ability to read what was in front of me. October was the month everything compressed. She was staying with me more irregularly by then, twice a week perhaps, and there was a quality to those visits that had shifted slightly from the ease of earlier months into something more managed, more scheduled, more like she was allocating time to me in a way that had not previously felt like allocation. Her phone had acquired a lock code that I had not seen before, not the same one as earlier in the year, a new 6-digit sequence that told me the old code had become insufficient for whatever she was managing. She had a new watch, a nice one, not extravagant but noticeably new, which she said she had bought herself with her reselling income. I looked at the watch, and I said nothing. The Monday before the Tuesday, the taxi driver told me everything. I had been out to a site meeting in the northern part of the city and was coming back to the condo in the early evening. I got into a taxi near the Sukhumvit intersection, a standard metered cab, and the driver was a heavy-set man in his 50s who had a small Buddha image on the dashboard and a photograph of what I assumed were his grandchildren tucked into the sun visor. His English was limited, and my Thai is functional at best, so we coexisted in the comfortable silence of two men going from one place to another with no particular obligation to fill the space between. He asked, as drivers do, where I lived, and I told him Jomtien, the building near the beach. He nodded, and then, with the complete absence of malice that makes this kind of thing so completely disorienting, he said that he had dropped a Farang lady from that building last week, very pretty, with another Farang man, Australian he thought from the accent, that they had gone to a hotel near the Bot bus stop. He said this the way you say anything that is ordinary to you. Just conversation, just a driver mentioning a thing he had seen. No awareness that the Farang sitting in his back seat had any connection to the Farang lady in question. I said something. I do not know what I said. I think I asked what the woman looked like, and he described her briefly and accurately. And so I sat in the back of the white Toyota Camry, while the Pattaya evening went past the windows in its usual chaos of lights and noise and tuk-tuks. and I understood with complete and immediate clarity that I had just been handed everything I had been refusing to look for. Over the preceding 5 months, the taxi cost 90 baht. I tipped him 200 because I did not have anything smaller and I could not think clearly enough to calculate change. I went upstairs to the condo and I sat on my balcony with a glass of water. I did not want whiskey, which surprised me. I had expected to want whiskey, and I went back through 11 months of accumulated evidence with the systematic attention I should have been applying all along. The hotel receipt from Soi 15, the Saturday she had been with her friend whose relationship had ended, the canceled plans, the new watch, the 12,000 baht for her mother's dental work. The name Craig from Australia, delivered smoothly in the context of the cosmetics business, a customer, a friendly acquaintance, a man who bought gifts for his family. The pattern, viewed now in its entirety and illuminated by 6 words from a taxi driver, was so obvious that I experienced something approaching wonder at how thoroughly my own confidence had insulated me from it. I called her. She answered on the second ring. I said I needed to see her tonight, and she said she was at her friend's, and I said I knew she was not at her friend's, and there was a silence that was long enough to be its own answer. She came over. It took her 40 minutes, which was the time required to make whatever preparations she felt were necessary for the conversation she now understood was coming. She walked in and she looked at me and I looked back and I did not say anything immediately because I was enjoying, and I will be honest about this, the specific satisfaction of being the person in the room who knows more than the other person yet knows. After 30 years of reading rooms, I was finally reading this one correctly, and she could see that I was reading it correctly and watching her understand that the story she had been managing had run out of road produced in me something that was not quite rage and not quite grief, but was sharply, bitterly satisfying in a way I had not anticipated. I said Craig's name. Just that. Just his name. The way you play a card when you want the other person to understand that you have the hand before you show them which cards are in it. She did not say anything for a moment, and then she said that Craig was a friend. And I said, I know what Craig is. And she looked at me, and then she looked at somewhere behind me, the Thai instinct toward face-saving directed at the middle distance, when there is no other available direction, and she said it was complicated. I said, I imagine it is. I asked how long. She said a few months. I did not believe a few months. I asked if she had been with him the Saturday she told me she was with her friend June, the friend whose relationship had ended. She said yes. So, at minimum since June, 5 months of simultaneous management. I asked if she had been with him when she told me about her mother's dental costs and I had transferred 12,000 baht. She did not answer directly, which was its own answer. I asked if he also thought they were exclusive. She looked at me for a moment and then she looked away again, and in that look I understood something that reorganized the entire situation. She had been running 2 Farangs simultaneously, which is a particular kind of enterprise that requires a level of operational coordination that, if I am being completely honest, I can only describe with something that was almost professional respect before the contempt reasserted itself. The moment I found myself almost admiring the operational complexity of what she had been doing, I understood that I had passed through the stage where it could still hurt me in the deep, personal way that betrayal hurts people who were genuinely caught off guard. This was not that. The hurt I felt in that room was real, but it was not the gut punch of the blindsided. It was closer to the feeling of losing a negotiation you had been aware you might lose, where the loss stings, but the loss itself is not a surprise, and the main thing you are left with is a clear-eyed understanding of exactly where you went wrong. She tried the economic justification first. She said she could not depend on any one person, that she never knew how long Farang stayed, that Craig had been around before I had become serious, that she had not known how to end it cleanly when things with me progressed. This was delivered with enough emotional authenticity that I recognized it as something partially true. She had probably been genuinely uncertain in the early months which relationship was going to develop into the more reliable income stream, and she had kept both running until the calculation became clearer, or until, as it turned out, a taxi driver made the calculation unnecessary. Then she tried the partial confession strategy, saying it had only been a few times, that it was not what I thought, that she had feelings for me that she did not have for him, that Craig was more of a financial arrangement than a relationship in any real sense. I said I found it interesting that she had just confirmed there was a financial arrangement while attempting to use the financial nature of it as a mitigation. She blinked. I think she had not expected that particular move. I am, as I said, 30 years into a career built on reading situations, and I was, for the first time in 11 months, reading this one with full and unobstructed attention, she cried. I sat with the crying for a while. I noticed during this period that the plant on my balcony needed watering, a small observation that occupied a corner of my mind with complete irrelevance while the rest of it processed what was happening in the room. Eventually, I said that she should collect what was at the condo and that I would return her key by leaving it with the building concierge. She asked if we could talk more. I said we had talked enough. She left an hour later, and I watered the plant and I poured a whiskey, which I wanted now, and I stood on the balcony watching the beach road below. I texted a mate of mine, a fellow Brit named Pete, who runs a diving operation out of Koh Chang and who has lived in Thailand long enough to have few illusions about anything. I said, "That thing you tried to warn me about in August turned out to be exactly what you said it was." He replied within 3 minutes, "Sorry, mate. I know. What happened?" I sent 3 sentences explaining what had happened. He sent back, "Taxi drivers know everything," which is both completely true and entirely useless as prior advice. Pete had tried, in his way, in August. We had been on a video call about something business-related, and he had asked how things were going with Wanpen, and I had said, "Well, mostly," and he had said, "Mate," in the careful way. That means a man is about to say something you are not going to enjoy hearing. He had said he just wanted to flag that bar girls in Pattaya very rarely maintain exclusive relationships in the way that Farang men expect them to, not as a judgment of the women specifically, but as a structural observation about an environment where financial precarity makes diversification a rational strategy. And was I quite certain about my situation? I had said yes, I was quite certain that Wanpen was not working in a bar anymore and that our situation was different. He had said righto and moved on with the grace of a man who has done what he can. I was, of course, not at all certain. I was refusing to be uncertain, which is a different thing. What I should have said when Pete asked was, "Actually, I am not certain. There are a number of things that are not adding up, and I would be interested in your read on what they mean." That is what I would have said in a business context without hesitation. That is the conversation I was refusing to have about my own personal situation, because having it would have required me to admit that Elliot Chambers, who reads rooms for a living, might not be reading his own room correctly. My ego wrote the check and Wanpen cashed it. That is the simplest accounting of what happened. In the weeks after she left, I ran the full reconstruction that you always run after something like this, going back through every piece of evidence I had accumulated and refused to act on, and understanding what each of it had been telling me. The hotel receipt from Soi 15, Craig, obviously. The new watch, either Craig or income from the arrangement with him, directed at visible consumption. The Saturday in June when she was supposedly with her heartbroken friend, Craig. The 12,000 baht for her mother's dental costs, I still do not know. Possibly true, possibly redirected, possibly both simultaneously, which is the specific cruelty of this kind of situation. You can never be entirely sure what was real and what was theater because a good operator keeps enough truth in the story to make the whole thing credible. I found Craig's profile eventually, the way you find things when you finally decide to look. He had a public Facebook account, the classic profile of a working Australian man in his 50s who has been coming to Pattaya for years, photos of him at various bars and restaurants along the strip. A few of him with Wanpen that had been posted months ago, presented as photos of a friend rather than a girlfriend. The particular social media management of a woman running a parallel portfolio. He had no idea I existed. I am virtually certain of that because his public affection in those photos had the uncalculated ease of a man who believes he is the only show in town. He was my mirror. He was doing exactly what I was doing, with the same information deficit I had, and the taxi driver had not happened to mention me to him. I felt, for a complicated moment, almost sympathetic toward Craig from Australia. Then I felt something considerably less sympathetic, and I closed the browser. I left Pattaya 3 weeks after that. The project in Jomtien had wrapped to a sufficient stage that I could hand it to a local manager, and there was work in Chiang Mai that I had been delaying, and I was ready to be somewhere that was not a city I associated entirely with the specific aftertaste of 11 months of selective blindness. I moved into a hotel near Niman Road in Chiang Mai, and I worked for 6 weeks, and I walked along the moat in the evenings, and I thought about what I wanted to say about the whole thing when I was ready to say anything at all. What I want to say is this, and I will be direct because I think directness is what serves people who are in situations similar to the one I was in. Confidence is not a protection. This is the central thing I learned, and it is the one I resist most because it requires revising a self-image I have carried for 30 years. I walked into an environment I did not fully understand, with the same assurance I would bring to a contract negotiation in a market I know well, and I applied my professional competence to a personal situation in which my professional competence was entirely irrelevant. Reading business rooms is not the same as reading intimate relationships, especially intimate relationships operating in economic contexts that create incentives invisible to the person who lacks the economic pressure that generates them. My confidence told me I was the exception. Everyone who has ever been in this situation has told themselves they were the exception. Almost nobody is the exception. The second thing I want to say is about what bar work history actually means. Wanpen told me she had left the bar 2 months before we met. Maybe she had. Maybe she had not. The more important thing, which I understood too late, is that the decision to leave bar work is not a single event, but an ongoing renegotiation with the economic reality that produced that work in the first place. A woman who has spent years in an environment where financial relationships with foreign men are standard and relatively uncomplicated does not immediately reconfigure her understanding of what relationships with foreign men look like the moment she leaves. The exit from the environment and the exit from the habits the environment creates are not the same transition, and they do not happen on the same timetable. I knew this as an abstract fact, and I failed to apply it to my specific situation because I did not want it to be relevant to my specific situation. The third thing I want to say is about the financial dimension, and I will say it plainly because it is the part that men in my situation most often avoid examining honestly. When you are significantly older than the woman you are with, and significantly wealthier, and the relationship exists in an environment where those two facts carry specific transactional weight, you are not in a simple love story. You are in a situation with a financial architecture that affects the incentives of everyone involved, including you, and pretending that architecture does not exist does not make it not exist. It just means you are navigating it without a map. The 12,000 baht I sent for dental costs that may or may not have been spent on dental costs is the most direct illustration of what happens when you decline to look at the map. You send money you cannot track to solve problems you cannot verify for a woman who may be managing you alongside at least one other man. I am not angry at myself for being generous. I am frustrated that I was generous without being clear-eyed because those two things do not need to be in conflict, and I let them be. The fourth thing I want to say is about service workers and what they see. Taxi drivers in Pattaya move people around a relatively small city at all hours. They develop, over years of doing this, a detailed working knowledge of who lives where, who goes with whom, and which Farangs are being driven between locations that tell a particular kind of story. The taxi driver who told me about Wanpen was not intending to inform me of anything specific. He was making conversation the same way he would mention traffic or weather. The information he delivered was available to him because his work gave him visibility I did not have. If the security guard at your building or the taxi driver who regularly takes your girlfriend somewhere or the woman who runs the food stall outside your apartment block seems to know more about your girlfriend's movements than you expected them to, that is not coincidence. That is the natural consequence of those people doing their jobs in a world where they can see things you are not positioned to see. Pay attention to the small awkwardnesses in those interactions. Pay attention to who seems to know what. The information infrastructure around you knows more than you do. The question is whether you are paying enough attention to receive what it is offering. The fifth thing I want to say is for any man who is right now sitting in a situation similar to the one I was sitting in, who has hotel receipts in bags and new watches with vague explanations and names that come up in conversation a little too smoothly. You are not being irrational. The unease is not ego. The specific anxiety that wakes you up at 3 in the morning and sends you standing in the dark near a window, running calculations. That anxiety is telling you something, and it is probably correct. A confident man does not investigate because investigating means admitting he might not be in control of the situation. But not investigating does not keep you in control of the situation. It just means you control your own ignorance, which is not the same thing. Check, look, ask, and if the answer is what the anxiety has been telling you it might be, end it cleanly and quickly, rather than spending another 3 months funding an arrangement whose full terms you have not been shown. She messaged me twice after I moved to Chiang Mai. The first message said she was sorry and she hoped I was okay. The second, 10 days later, asked if I had her charger. I replied to neither. There was nothing useful to say in response to the first, and the charger was not in my possession and would not have been returned if it were. The taxi driver was just doing his job. He had no idea he was ending anything. He was talking about something he had seen, the way you mention anything ordinary that passes through your day. It cost him nothing to say, and it cost me 11 months of comfortable certainty and a not insignificant amount of money. And, if I am being completely straight with you, a useful portion of my self-image as a man who sees clearly and reads situations well. I see more clearly now. I will give myself that much. I moved through Chiang Mai and then through a work stint in Phnom Penh, and I am back in Bangkok as of 2 months ago, managing a new project near the Ratchadaphisek corridor that is interesting and complicated in exactly the ways I prefer. I am 66 years old and I am single, and I am, with certain qualifications that I am working on, reasonably well. I have not stopped going to restaurants alone in the evenings, because a man who stops doing the things he enjoys because something went wrong is letting something go wrong twice. I have not sworn off Thailand, which some people back home expected me to do. Thailand did not do anything to me. A specific person made specific choices in a specific situation, and none of that is a country's responsibility. I still find this part of the world more interesting than almost anywhere else I have worked, and I intend to keep working here, and I intend to do so with rather more attention to the things that are sitting directly in front of me than I brought to the 11 months in Pattaya. Sometimes I think about the taxi driver. I hope he is well. I hope someone at some point tipped him better than 90 baht for something he said that genuinely mattered. I hope he went home that night and ate dinner and watched television and thought nothing more about the Farang he had driven to Jomtien, who had seemed slightly strange when he mentioned the woman from the building near the beach. That is all it was to him. Just a thing he saw. Just a fare that went somewhere and got out. He will never know that 6 words he said in a white Toyota Camry on a Tuesday evening restructured someone's understanding of their own recent life. He will never know that the tip he received, 110 baht over the meter from a man who was moving too slowly and thinking too hard, was for information that cost him nothing to give and cost the recipient considerably more to receive. I am the one who had to figure out what to do with it, and I am still, if I am being honest, figuring that out. But at least I am doing it with an accurate picture of the situation, which is more than I had for 11 months. And that, at this point, is going to have to be enough.